Good morning. It is Sunday morning, and I'm going to take a moment to provide a geopolitical update because it's lacking in my news feed, and I can provide some insight perhaps to somebody else. The most recent big event is Iran's counter-strike against Israel after Israel bombed Iran's embassy compound and killed several generals and other officers. And also, on the economic front, in the last week, silver and gold both had epic runs. They got monkey hammered down basically right before the close on Friday, so that the weekly close data doesn't demonstrate all of the momentum that they had. But gold continues hitting new all-time highs, and silver just about touched $30 an ounce. So what that means is not so much that the price of the metal is going up, of the monetary metals, gold and silver, but what it means is that the value of the US dollar is going down because the metals stay the same. It's the same amount of metal, but that it costs more dollars to get the metal means the dollars are worth less. So that's the ongoing trend of ever since the Federal Reserve came into existence, and then accelerating after the US got off the gold standard, is the planned worthlessness of the US dollar. And the dollar is a global reserve currency, and it's a global value system. It's the backing of the values of the global empire, civilization, whatever you want to call it. The world order that exists is backed on US debt notes, and they're actually Federal Reserve debt notes. They're not even a US creation. They're a creation of a cartel of banks that controls the US, just like a parasite controls a host to make it do what it wants and not what is in the host's best interest, but it incentivizes and creates the outcome that's best for the parasite. And oftentimes when you see a being infested by such a parasite that transcends dimensionally their capacity to control it, because otherwise, if they were able to, they would probably just rid themselves of the parasite. Yet the parasite dominates the host, and then the host ends up serving the ends of the parasite. So for the US is controlled by a cabal of banks, and those banks are the parasites sucking the wealth and the energy out of the US. And because that parasitical currency, the US dollar, and it's a parasite because it's a debt-based thing. There's always more debt than currency that exists. So it's, by its very nature, it's sucking value out of the host, and the debt can never get paid. The debt only ever grows, and the debt exceeds the capacity for repayment. So it is a scheme of wealth and energy extraction, which is why it is parasitical. And the people who it serves are an elite cabal of bankers, the people who are the stakeholders in the Federal Reserve banking cabal, which isn't a government institution. It's a private corporation, a trust, a union of banks working as a monopoly to control the entire economic system of the US and thereby the world. So the entire world is infected by this economic parasite. Then we get to the situation of Israel and the United States. And similarly, Israel is like a parasite in that region of the world, a Zionist entity of Zionism is just another word for apartheid, of racism, of domination of one group of people over all of the others, and their inherent view that they are superior than others. So it's a ethnocentric, quasi-religious apartheid state that dominates through force and other means and subterfuge, and just basically existing in a higher dimensional plane than those whom it exists, upon whom it exists as a parasite. So the U.S. backs Israel, as does France and Germany and the other Rothschild central bank controlled countries. So the Rothschilds kind of took over the financial establishments of the Germans, the French, the British, the Italians, and the U.S. back in the 19th century, and then further in the 20th century, and now even further in the 21st century. So it's a multi-century, several generation long plan of parasitism and domination. And it's that family, but it's really a corporation, because it's not really a family. It's just the Rothschild. It was the red, that's in German is Red Shield. It was just a corporation for wealthy banking capital interest families in Germany, and then they created this corporation, the Rothschilds, to defend their and further their interests. So it was this entity that created Israel in the first place, and they created Israel as an extension of their power and as a bridgehead in the Middle East to prevent the Islamic cultures who enforced, for a time, they enforced the decrees against usury, which is the nature of how the Rothschilds get all their wealth, is through usury. And so the Islamic culture represents a threat to that central banking cabal because they don't accept usury. So it's basically a struggle of the usurious against the unusurious. And yet, at this point, many of the leaders of the Islamic world are subverted and controlled by those capital interests and benefit from them. Whether it's Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Jordan or Egypt or some others in the region, in some ways Turkey as well. They're all under the thumb of the empirical forces that are the officers and enforcers, the agents of the Western central banking cabal, represented by the Fed and the US dollar. Once again, the Fed is not related to the government. It's not related to the federal government. The Fed is the Federal Reserve. They named it Federal Reserve for the same reason that Federal Express named itself Federal Express, to make it seem like it's connected to the federal entity, when in fact it's an independent corporation. And yes, there's some aspects of, like, the boardman has to get approved, the chairman has to get approved by the president or something, but it's all just for show. Because the president serves them, and the senators and the congressmen serve the capital interests. The corporations serve the capital interests who are creating the capital itself. They control the Capitol in Washington, though their real capital is in New York City, the Empire State. That's the central point of the empire of debt and economic slavery. And that's been its purpose since its inception, was empire. I mean, it was founded by the Dutch, who were in control of the maritime sea trade at the time, and they managed to get their bridgehead upon the American continent, and then it was just inherited. The control of the bridgehead was inherited by various powers over time. The British, and then the various other German and Italian, and then eventually and Jewish, and eventually becoming the center of the capital interest in a way that Rome used to be, and in a way that London used to be. But both of them still are, and because they serve the same ends, they're all in collusion insofar as serving the ends of the elite and powerful, whether it's Rome, whether it's London, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's New York City. These are centers of power of that empire. You could say Paris and maybe like Berlin, but the first four are kind of the primary. And three of those four are their own sovereign states within other states. The city of London is a sovereign state within Great Britain. Washington, D.C. is its own territory separate from the other 50 states. And then in Rome, the Vatican is its own sovereign state within Italy. And as a little aside, CERN, the particle accelerator underneath Switzerland and part of France, is also a sovereign entity with its own sovereign territory underneath the earth and unaccountable to other sovereign entities. So that's a bit of background. So where are we going? What are we talking about from here? Well, we're seeing an ongoing transition of power from one system which has been able to maintain power for centuries and then consolidate it through the World War I and World War II, and then many smaller wars ever since. And smaller in the sense, like Vietnam, actually, they had more destructive weaponry that was utilized than World War II. So in a way, it's not even smaller. It was more destructive. It was just that less people died. It was more of an ecocide. But the war machine grows in its capacity to destroy. And the trend continues, and we're in a stage of competition amongst rising powers and then pre-existing powers, and that's the reason for the war in Ukraine. That's the reason for the ongoing warfare and conflict around Israel, and that's the reason that the gold and silver, the precious metals prices, are skyrocketing. So the precious metals, their ownership represents money. So if you want to keep your savings in money, then you keep it in gold and silver. There are many other currencies and there are many other speculative assets that one can invest in or speculate in, but those two are fundamentally money. The dollar is not money, it's a currency. It has no fundamental value. It's simply a derivative of the compliance of the populations that accept it, and the network effect, the value of that network effect that's formed as a result of that compliance. So the compliance is a derivational value, and then the network effect from that is a derivational value, and therefore what people are thinking is money. Most people think the dollar is money, but it's actually a double derivative of confidence, essentially. So it's a confidence scheme where all the value is invested, is doubly derived, which means that it's inherently fragile, and all of the actions that take place are oriented towards maintaining the people's acceptance of the currency and their compliance. Those two things are essential. So if there's a time when those things are questioned or threatened, events can be engineered in such a way to bolster those two factors, the people's acceptance of the currency and the people's compliance. And the COVID agenda is a perfect example. So people's compliance was mandated in ways which were unreasonable, but which were coercive. And then paired with that, people were given more of the currency. So people's acceptance of the currency, people's obedience and compliance were bolstered through the force of the state and threats and fear mechanisms and propaganda. And then people's acceptance of the currency was bolstered by just giving everybody a bunch of currency. My response to the COVID agenda was non-compliance. I did not comply. I never wore a mask a single time. I initiated court cases against, or at least a single one, against those who discriminated against my ability to exist without being compliant. I confronted all the people and their projected fears and everything every time I went out without a mask. And when people required me to test or vaccinate in order to see them, I did not comply. And when they gave out free currency, I did not accept the currency. But most people aren't like me. Most people will accept free currency and will comply when they are coerced. And that's what the whole agenda was formulated to result in. And it worked. It was effective. But the blowback of the agenda is that it doesn't necessarily work again the second time, so they have to figure out a new mechanism to create those effects. So the new Black Swan event will have the same effects. It will increase people's compliance, and then it will increase their acceptance of the currency. So a good reason or a good excuse to give people currency is to first shut down the economy as it exists so that they're dependent upon the currency that you give them. So you just need to, like, problem, reaction, solution. So if the solution is to give people currency and to increase their compliance, then first you need to create a reaction so that people will accept that. So if you shut down the economy, then people's reaction is, I need money, so I'll accept the money. And if you introduce a threat that people are afraid of, then their reaction will be, protect me, government. I will comply if only you generate these rules for compliance. We're glad to comply because we're terrified of mysterious propagandistic things. So you're working your way backwards from the solution to the reaction, then to the problem. So all that needs to be created is a problem that leads to the shutting down of the economy and the people's request for more rules, for more controls. So because they already played the medical card, the next card is the warfare card. So Now that this round of aggression between the Iran and Israel has proceeded, Israel starting it by bombing the Iranian embassy and killing their generals, and then Iran responding with direct strikes against Israel, of which it seems that initial accounts are that 331 weapons, Iranian weapons, were used against Israel between drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And somewhere between 96 and 98%, maybe between 95 and 98%, somewhere in that range, were destroyed en route. So the strike was perhaps 2 to 5% effective insofar as what was sent, and yet each one that's destroyed costs money. And so on some level it's an economic war where the aggressor's weapons are destroyed by the defender's weapons, and it becomes a cost analysis of who spent more money to destroy the other one's weapons or to exhaust the other one's weapons. So part of what's going on is the overall warfare in the macro sense is attritional. How many air defense missiles can be created versus how many drones and other things can be created, and at what rate. And there's multiple theaters of operation, and there's some of the same suppliers in different theaters, and then different weapons used in different theaters. And currently, look, I did some art over here. Currently, the trend is that while the West has greater technology in some ways, its products are more expensive and the production rate is less than the competing powers, who are able to make things cheaper and maybe slightly less technologically advanced in some examples, though in other examples they're more technologically advanced, like certain kind of hypersonic missiles and things like that. So that the balance of power is that the competing powers are out-competing economically because of their economic base, and somehow I'm going to circle this all back and wrap it all up and put a bow on it for this video. So what am I really getting at here? Well, what we're seeing is continued escalations and continued volatility. And for those reasons, the fragility of the Western economic system becomes more and more evident, because it's all based on a double derivative and it's not based on fundamental value. So we see the continual increase in the price, the nominal value of precious metals, which is set to continue occurring as various peoples deleverage themselves from the double derivative con, and then they reallocate the value that is available out of that Ponzi scheme into actual money or productive capacity or other real assets. And so in that process, what we see is that, for example, the United States, whose economy is 70% consumption, and that consumption is subsidized by the fact that the Federal Reserve is based out of the United States, and a lot of people are getting free money and are subsidized by that economic system, which subsidizes a political system, which subsidizes the people's compliance and their acceptance of the currency. So there's no better way to get people compliant than to put them on welfare, because their income is dependent upon the state, and then their compliance is therefore guaranteed by the state, because you can always just threaten to take away their basic living potential. And so people who are on welfare are dependent, and out of their dependency and their lack of capacity to provide for themselves, they are objects with the potential to be weaponized by that state in circumstances when the state needs agents to facilitate its will. So like during the COVID thing, the people who were yelling at other people to wear a mask, the people who were telling other people, you got to get the jab if you want to come over, or you got to get tested if you want to be around us, those were the willing accomplices, the agents of that control system, that matrix of control, which is why the movie The Matrix is such a great story and analogy for the current times, and also where it ultimately heads, because it heads in a direction which is anti-life, which is all based upon materialism, technology, and ultimately control of the fundamental life force of the being, while the being is blinded by propaganda and exists in a state which is incapacitated and fundamentally parasitized, which is then revealed in the reality of the Matrix, that all the people are just like batteries plugged into this giant machine being fed propaganda as their life energy is getting sucked out of them in order to maintain that control grid, that machine, the delusion that everybody shares as if it's reality, when in fact they're all just being blinded by the propaganda. But there's a group of people who have detached themselves from that control matrix, who have moved off grid, who exist as sovereign free beings, and then after they separate themselves from that matrix, then they end up working together in order to thrive and for their own best interests outside of that control grid. And then, of course, the control grid goes to war against those people because its whole purpose is control, and therefore it can't tolerate those who are outside of its control. So you have a host population who the parasite exists off of, and then the parasite goes to war with life itself, the free elements and vessels of life. The warfare parasite system wages war against that because that is its threat to overall control and dominance. Yet for that parasite to continue its system, it needs to maintain the control of the host population, and it needs to maintain their acceptance of the fundamental value and mechanism of control, which is the currency, but also the confidence and the trust in that currency and the whole system and the value system. So when people are indoctrinated in the public indoctrination camps for the youth in such a way that their compliance is incentivized, and then they're oriented towards a system of policing each other psychologically, and then also oriented towards money being the debt-based currency. So they're indoctrinated to think that the double derivative currency of enslavement, they think that's their money, and they think that's the value system, and all this is indoctrinated through the public education system, which is a mechanism of control that the parasite controls. So the parasite controls, so all of the people that are slaves to that system, they give their children up to their slave masters, so that their slave masters can indoctrinate their children to ensure that the children serve that system of parasitism or slavery. So the ways out of that system are largely made illegal. And so things like natural medicine is seen as the most dangerous, the most illegal things relative to that system of control. For example, cannabis or natural fungus that leads to psychological revelations. Those things are considered the most dangerous, the most controlled substances in existence, because they threaten the value system of a value system which has to be based upon the double derivative debt slavery currency. Because when people have those natural medicines, they might see the value of the sun. They might see the value of the rest of life. They might see the value of time inherently in a state which is liberated, a state of being which is free. That might inherently have value, which is greater than the value derived in currency notes from time spent slaving away to do some profit-oriented task. So someone who is just spending their time consuming cannabis, say, and they're not being productive in society, in a way that's a revolutionary act, because they are existing in a value system which is not controlled and is not subsidizing the parasite. They're basically living freely, aligning with nature. And so there's all sorts of propaganda mechanisms in order to deride anyone who strays away from the herd. And then there's shepherds of the herd who are always ready to guide the herd towards deriding those who are outside of the control of the shepherd of the herd, who is seemingly like one of the herd, but in fact they are of a predatory nature, who ultimately seek to extract value from the herd, even though it seems like they're acting in the herd's best interest. But their intent is to milk the herd, or to slaughter the herd, or to survive off of the existence of the herd. So that's where you get the phrase, the wolf in sheep's clothing. It seems like the people in the herd are like sheep, but really there's predatory ones dressed up like sheep that are able to disguise themselves as if they are one of the herd. Those who are outside of the herd and who are proud of it, they make no attempt to disguise themselves. They don't hide behind the mask. They do not comply with the stupid mandates, and they're not afraid to show that. They might have a pride relative to that, but the pride is ultimately not really helpful. And yet, or it's only helpful insofar as it promotes or incentivizes the behavior which doesn't subsidize the parasite, and so which promotes freedom. So we're at about the 3/4 mark. Somehow I have to circle this back, all the things that I just said, to get back to a central core and point of this, which is ultimately, it's just a narrative which I'm providing to give my perspective of reality as it is, as everything is unfolding. And so, to speak for myself, I have moved off the grid, off the matrix control grid, where everyone's subsidizing is feeding into that system. So I'm not paying some sort of rental fee for the land which I've settled, or for my property, or for my house. And so, whereas most people are thinking of, how do I maximize my dollar income, I think about, how do I minimize my necessity for dollars? Because the less I require to be integrated with that dollar system, the more liberated I am from that system. And yet still, I exist in an economic model where I'm building things and I need to spend that currency in order to get the building materials to continue building the infrastructure for this foundation, which I'm building. So whether that's collecting people's discarded property or buying additional property and integrating it together into infrastructure that has fundamental utility value, I need to take part in that system to a certain degree. Yet I needn't promote the parasite. I can rid myself from the parasite while still relating with other parasitized people without necessarily judging them, while accepting them as they are. And fundamentally appreciate and love and have gratitude for the other people, even when the people demonstrate... The cat reoriented me. So ultimately, we're talking about value systems here. And the goal is to liberate oneself from the value system of a debt-based matrix of control, and to orient with the value system which values life and quality of life and respects life. So, for example, when relating with people who are parasitized, the goal is to relate with the aspect of the person which is their nature, which is their appreciation for life, while recognizing the parasitical qualities, but not trying to criticize or anything, because the parasite will always act to defend itself, the programming that is inherent. So right now, the signs from the animals are all telling me that you're going too far. I'm going too far. I need to end this. I need to end this within 2 minutes. I need to circle it all back. So the goal here is to just focus on life, appreciate life, and create the best quality of life possible while separating from the systems of slavery, from the financial parasites and whatnot. And that is done one day at a time, one action at a time, to orient oneself in a way so that that's the trajectory is necessary. That can be done through reflection and journaling and conversation with other people and inspiration from other people. But I can say from where I'm at along this journey, there is no other way. At some point, I might just get killed by that system and its agents for living a life that is valuable to me, and I see as valuable to all of life. Christ could be the word that represents all of life in all of its many different forms. So if one is to live a life which is valued by Christ, which is a value to Christ, then the actions that one takes throughout life are going to be living in a value system which is aligned with life, with Christ. It's not going to be subsidizing a parasitical entity control system which wars against life fundamentally. So I guess that's kind of the core message. And as we see all these signs of escalation, we see the signs of the system falling apart. To protect one's own purchasing power, we can invest that speculative value in money, can withdraw the various mechanisms and ways in which we are subsidizing that control system, whether that means stopping paying taxes or stop complying with things that don't promote our best interests, or stopping voting for a system, stop ascribing your sovereign right onto these politicians who are only serving a system which is anti to your life and your well-being. Whether it's maybe living in a different way, in a different place, or starting over, or going backwards. Unlearning becomes more important than learning when everything that one has learned has been indoctrination. So it's like you go through a whole system of public indoctrination. The next necessary thing, as soon as you're free from it, you need to unlearn just about everything that they indoctrinated with you, and then start over from a place of truth, so that everything that follows, one has a core of truth which to tune to and to use as a resonator to orient towards understanding what is true. Because without that core of truth, we cannot discern what is true and what is untrue. So running out of time, that's the end of the message. It's sort of like just my perspective on the current situation. And hang in there, everyone, and do good.